And what we've been finding is there's some really core key things that are critical to keeping us on target for getting to no place left that has not heard the gospel. And so if we're going to be a good steward of that task, it really means that we've got to be dialed into tracking the right things so that we can assess how are we doing towards getting to that task. Hey there, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast, where I, Mark Gearing, together with your host, Dave Miller, explore the head, the heart, and the hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. And it's Thanksgiving, or Thanksgiving week, the week that I'm recording this, just me today. And you're going to listen to this after that, but I just want to give you a short update this week. But I think it's going to pack a punch, and it's going to be helpful for you. But a short update into tracking specifically. And, you know, if you've been a long-time listener to the podcast, or even if you're new with us, we use a framework of 5 T's that's really helpful for developing a strategy. And one of those T's is tracking. I'm going to list for you the 5 T's, and then I want to talk with you a little bit more about how tracking has been rolling out in our context here in New York City and even across the Northeast. But those 5 T's that are really helpful for thinking about how to develop a strategy for your context are target, tools, teaming, training, and tracking. And I'll leave it to you to check out the other episodes on our podcast for more in-depth information into those T's. They're super helpful for thinking through, again, how to develop out that strategy for your context. It's comprehensive in the way that it rolls that out. And each T actually answers a question that can help us to dial in and make sure that we are being a good steward of our context. And that T of tracking, it really answers the question of how are we doing? And so when we first began to introduce this topic of the 5 T's, it was probably a couple years ago now or so, but when we first began to introduce this and began to talk about this idea of 5 T's, Dave and I made an episode on tracking. And, you know, if you happen to have been with us that long, when we talked about tracking, we said, you know, both of us got a D in tracking or an F in tracking. And tongue-in-cheek, now I'll say, maybe I've got a C. Maybe I'm doing a little bit better in the topic of tracking. Not a lot, but maybe just a little bit better in the topic of tracking. And the reality is it used to be really intuitive, the way that I would think about tracking. It wasn't that we weren't tracking or we weren't in some way assessing how are we doing. It was the fact that it was more of an intuitive assessment. And I think for a lot of leaders, it's usually intuitive in how we approach the idea of tracking. But what really I woke up to was, as I began to understand the 5 T's, was the importance of tracking, both for being a good steward of the work, but also for helping to develop leaders that have focus on the right things, and the DNA then multiplies around that. And so one of the phrases that we'll use around the topic of tracking is, you can't coach what you can't see. And so if we're gonna coach effectively, we need to be tracking, and we need to be empowering tracking within our networks in a way that results in the most helpful information so that we can coach where there are barriers to get to the target. But today, what I wanted to share with you, this is kind of burying the lead, but I'm going to jump into it now, that topic of how have we been tracking in New York City and even across the East Coast as we've been collaborating with others around this topic of tracking. And what we've been finding is there's some really core key things that are critical to keeping us on target for getting to no place left that has not heard the gospel. And so if we're going to be a good steward of that task, it really means that we've got to be dialed into tracking the right things so that we can assess how are we doing towards getting to that task, right? What we've been finding is if we think about those 5 parts of kingdom growth, 4 fields or 5 parts from Mark chapter 4, verses 26 to 29, we see that this pattern of Jesus, it actually, we can find it all the way throughout the Gospels, all the way throughout the New Testament. It really is our standard of what success should look like and what it should look like for us as we're engaging in a new area. And then as we're empowering the continued work, it really should look like entry, where there is new fields being engaged. It should look like gospel, that the gospel is getting out and multiplying, that there are many people being equipped with the gospel. It should look like discipleship. We're stewards of the Great Commission. We should be seeing disciples made that walk in obedience to Jesus and the commands that he's given. It should look like church, Jesus and Paul, they defined success as local ownership with a church planted in that context. That's how Paul said when he was done in an area. And then finally, it should look like establishing of leaders, whether that's elders through depth or new apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic teams, apes that are carrying the task forward. It's going to look like those 5 parts. And that's where the tracking comes in, because if we're going to track to see that happen, there's some key metrics, and it can't be too many that really need to be in place. And here in the East Coast, what we've been tracking are 3 main things that tell us if we're on target for those 5 parts. So I'm going to list off those 3 things now, and then I'm going to connect them to how they track the 5 parts. And those 3 main things are this. We're tracking gospel shares. We want to track faithfulness to the task. We're tracking baptisms because we want to see not only disciples made, but disciples from the harvest. And then we're tracking churches because we want to track to see local ownership of that task and multiplying leaders. So now I want to connect those together. Why those 3 things? We could track a lot of things. Honestly, we can't really track a lot of things, if I'm really honest, in terms of just the practical of what it takes to actually see other leaders invest in tracking. You really can't track a lot of things, but there's a lot of options of what we could track, right? There's a lot of things that we could focus on, but we focused on those 3 things. Why? Well, I want to answer that question. So we track gospel shares, and the reason why is because we want to be faithful to the task of seeing the gospel enter new fields and be proclaimed mouth to ear. So if we're going to do that, we've got to actually track the gospel being proclaimed. And so we do that in our churches here. We track, is the gospel getting out, and how many gospel shares are happening week to week. Number 2, we track baptisms. Now, a lot of churches track baptisms, whether it's a traditional church model or a movement church model. But we track baptisms for a specific reason, because we want to not only see disciples made, so we're talking about entry and gospel, that's where we're tracking gospel, but we want to also see disciples made, so we're going to track baptisms for that reason. Why? We could just track disciples, right? But what is a disciple? How do you define a disciple? There's a lot of ambiguity there. We want to track baptisms because it tells us, are we getting to new disciples from the harvest? We want to celebrate longtime disciples learning how to obey and continuing to grow in their obedience, but ultimately we want to see new disciples made, because that tells us if we're getting to no place left, where the gospel is continuing to move forward. Baptism is a metric that's going to tell us that. So we're up to discipleship now, entry, gospel, discipleship. And the last thing that we track are churches, because that tells us if we're getting to church. And then if you have a church, it means that you've got leaders. A church does not sustain and continue unless you're going to have leaders. And then if you have some sort of depth of generational growth, that tells you if you're getting to multiplying churches and multiplying leaders. So that also then tells us, are we getting to local ownership, the way that Paul defined it? But those 3 things of gospel shares, baptisms, and churches, if I had to really reduce it down, if I had to just pick 2 things, I would pick baptisms and churches, because they're going to tell me if I'm getting to new people and new places and the gospel is continuing to go forth. But if I can add on one more, I'm going to add on gospel shares because we want to see that continuing to multiply. So hopefully that's helpful for you. We need to be tracking, and if we're tracking those 3 things, we can actually identify how to coach effectively. If those things, if we have information around that's lacking, or there's a lack of competence or skills in those areas, all those things can help us to begin to be more effective coaches. But again, you can't coach what you can't see. This is what we're tracking here in the East Coast. We found it to be really helpful towards being faithful to that task of no place left. Hopefully that's helpful for you. If it is, would love for you to leave a comment. Give us a review, if you don't mind, on whatever podcast platform of your choice. That it's encouraging to us, and give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you, and would love to hear how this is rolling out in your context. And tell us what you're tracking. If you're tracking something else or tracking something different, we'd love to hear that too. So until next time. Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.